Welcome and thanks for tuning in for another installment of Tips and Tricks for Writing Manuscripts, Episode 4, Heroes and Villains. In the last episode, I was talking a lot about different types of characters and getting your character roster together. And one of the vital aspects of forming your manuscript is deciding who's who in terms of heroism and villainy. Few stories that I can think of off the top of my head got away without having both a protagonist and an antagonist. One, I can't remember the author, it was called Dragon Boy. It didn't really have an antagonist, but it had a protagonist. It was a basically coming-of-age sort of story. And most of the conflict was internal. It was a personal journey, I guess you could say. But most mainstream and widely received and successful stories have an antagonist and a protagonist. It's a story as old as mankind can remember is the bad guy and the good guy. So we're going to take this episode to discuss what makes a hero or a villain and makes them successful in literature. I think literature is one of the hardest mediums to convey a potent hero or villain because as writers we have to create them from top to bottom. We don't have visual aids or storytelling through dialogue like the movie industry might have. So we have to create the whole picture in a way that almost anybody that picks up our text can create, using their imagination, using their ability to create pictures in their mind to make these villains and heroes for us. And that can make or break a story, is how well your audience will receive your characters and their alignment to chaos or order, so to speak. And so hopefully I can give you some tips on how to make your heroes or your villains more potent, more believable, because that's the ultimate goal of good and evil, is to make your audience believe them. That should be one of the most arduous yet one of the most rewarding tasks of an author, is to be able to bring those heroes and villains to life. So for a minute, let's discuss what is good and evil. There's so many philosophical ways to look at what is considered right and wrong, because morality, which is at the center of most heroes and villains, their morality, their moral fiber, is as relative as pain, is as relative as how people see the world. And so good and bad can be turned on their heads, and people can be led to see, light as darkness and vice versa. So let's talk about what really makes us good or evil. One thing about certain characters, like the two we're speaking of, is their flaws and their strengths. That's really going to, in particular your hero, his flaws and his strengths are going to make or break him. And you don't want your hero too perfect or too damaged. It's going to be really difficult for your audience to receive him as the good guy if he's too much of one or the other. You have to have a balance in his personality versus his physicality. What would be a good example? I guess one of the good examples is Aragorn from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's difficult to see him as the hero, but it's just as difficult to see him as a villain. Not to say that he ever was a villain, in that he had his flaws, but he also had incredible strengths that added to his heroism. But it really lets you relate to him through his personal struggles, the weight of his lineage, his unrequited, well, I guess unrequited wouldn't be really the right word, his seemingly unreachable love for Arwen. I keep getting confused with Eowyn. They sound too much the same for me. And the unavoidable fact that getting involved with the Fellowship is going to bring him to the climax of his relationship with the ring and his forefathers, and the shame of their shortcomings on his head. So that makes him a hero, and the fact that he rises up against it, but he's also a very believable hero. He's a relatable character because he suffers from similar doubts and emotional struggles that people do, that regular people do. So that makes him an excellent hero. Even though you don't really see him as a hero until you get further down the line, the Two Towers and Return of the King. That's when you really see his heroism shine. And and he was very well balanced with his flaws and his strengths. Mostly his strength to face up to what his forefathers did and to still continue, even though he knew ultimately where it would lead him. And that's usually the best the best received type of hero is that reluctant hero. Because it's kind of a running gag. People who deserve the power the most want it the least. So it's a good thing to keep that in mind when you're writing for your hero. Uh, uh, so you don't want them too perfect. Unless there's a particular plot point that a immaculate hero can serve, such as an allegory or almost a moral lesson that they can teach you that not everything that glitters is gold, then I suppose a perfect hero has its place, but you shouldn't bank on your main character, your main protagonist, to be that immaculate hero, because it's going to be difficult for your readers to get attached to someone who's perfect, because nobody's perfect. And the same thing goes for villains. Villains often become villains because of a shortcoming, because of a moral flaw. They failed to prevent or provoke something. They failed to succeed somewhere by doing right, when doing the wrong thing would have allowed them to achieve that goal. And while that's all well and good, and while it's very true, it seems like some of the greatest villains through history, through our own history, have come about due to a shortcoming. It makes you wonder, Adolf Hitler being a perfect example, he got into politics because a French art school wouldn't take him. They wouldn't accept him simply because he couldn't draw people. So he got into politics instead. And I've seen some of his work. It's very good. And just because of that one issue that kept him out of school, he got into politics, and we all know how that ended up. So there are multitudes of villains throughout literature and history that chose their path due to what might be seen as an egregious injustice on their part. And yet for us it might seem like a petty thing, but for them it was vital. It was a cornerstone of their life that was just ripped out from under their feet, and naturally that's painful. And a lot of people tend to transform their pain into a galvanizing ambition to something else, and oftentimes that's going to lead to catastrophic disaster. So you really got to consider that when you're creating your villain, especially when you're creating your villain story. Why? That is one of the biggest questions you can ask yourself when you're creating a hero, a villain, is why they chose their path. Why did they choose chaos over order and vice versa? Why did they manage to let go of their morality and choose to be the victimizer instead of the victim, so to speak? The word victim is a very interesting word to study when creating these characters, because you have to see, what degrees of one or the other are they. In my own personal philosophy, you stop being the victim once you become the victimizer. You forfeit sympathy when you transform your pain and redirect it onto others to I guess you could say, what's the word, squelch that hurt, is by watching other people suffer what you suffer. How that makes people feel better, I don't personally understand, but it works for a lot of villains. Disney villains in particular. Disney created such a wonderful cell of incredible villains, and they've evolved from the first animated film, Snow White, all the way up to Wall-E and even Brave. I guess would be a really good example of a modern Disney film where the villain has evolved. because in the earlier films, they're very literal villains. They're very tangible. They're right there. You understand their motivations. But as the movies progress through the decades, they become less literal in their evil and more metaphoric, which we'll talk about here shortly. But all of them had a certain motivation, and they started from more petty, more self-centered, and eventually got into something a little more complex than that. Psychology being a hobby of mine, I've kind of dissected some of the Disney villains to figure out, what really made them tick, what made them different, even though basically they were all villains. And some of them were incredibly callous villains. They were just bad to the bone, to coin a phrase, I suppose. Starting off with the first, the Wicked Queen of Snow White. At a glance, as simple as the original Grimm tale was in its regards to evil, the queen was jealous. She was jealous of Snow White and wanted her out of the picture. In our early days, with the simple way we think when we're children, that makes perfect sense. But as we grow older, we realize where could we find sympathy with this villain? Where could we humanize her to where we could understand, and in a way, find something in that villain of ourselves that we don't always acknowledge. And that tends to make villains more potent, is when you can relate to them. And when you psychologically take apart the Wicked Queen, you see a control freak, an insecure control freak. So you have someone who is beautiful, but is insecure about it, and therefore you have jealousy of someone who could potentially, for lack of a better word, dethrone her. So she was a control freak, and she was incredibly jealous. So she wanted all the competition out of the picture so there was no threat. And then you go down the line as villains become less and less literal, and their villainy is less visible, because you'll notice a tactic that Disney uses. Their villains are very angular in their design, Jafar being the perfect example. Yes, he had round accents to his character design, but that shows a balance in the artistic fashion, but he's very angular. Scar was incredibly hard-edged in his face in particular. So that often gives away who the villains are. But they kind of broke that tradition with Treasure Planet, and Long John Silver was very round. But he was visibly grotesque to a degree. So that kind of tipped you off. That plays to your visual senses, because humans are wired to judge by what they see. It's a simple fact. But when we go into WALL-E, the supposed villain of WALL-E was the autopilot. But some, I think, will agree with me when the real villain, the real antagonist, was by and large, with their idealism of consume in excess. That was a less literal villain. It was more metaphoric. But still, Otto plays an antagonistic part. However, his motivations were far different from By and Large or from the Wicked Queen. His reasons were not selfish. He was programmed to protect the ship and its crew and its occupants. It was designed to keep the best interests of the passengers in mind. That's why he resisted the captain's orders to return to Earth. So, and while he was creepy and had a lot of the traits most Disney villains share in his unsettling features and voice, he was, I guess you couldn't say he was a villain. He was an antagonist, sure, because he resisted the good intentions of the supposed protagonist, but it was not for selfish reasons. So you can't call him a villain, though in the film he acted as one. So you could translate him as a villain, but you could still understand what he was doing. So it made him relatable and less received as wicked, and more so erring on the side of good intentions, which is something we're all guilty of. Let's see. One thing about your heroes and villains is to avoid good and evil for its own sake. Yes, it works. It is a viable device in literature as well as movies and other media, because there is a cosmic balance of chaos and order, and they both have their agents, and they are going to be that element incarnate. So they really are for their own sake, such as let me see, I had it and I lost it. Chernabog from Disney's Fantasia. I know I keep going back to Disney, but they have such a plethora of examples that I can use, so I can't really avoid it. Chernabog in Fantasia was an element of darkness. He was chaos. He was an incarnate of the things that go bump in the night, which serves a purpose. Yes, when you're writing human characters or human-esque characters that are representing good and evil, you don't want them to simply be for their own sake. However, if you have agents of those characters, such as familiars or monsters or minions or whatever, then that's okay to fit them into that description. They can be for their own sake because they are serving a higher purpose. However, you don't want your main characters to fall in that, because that just erases their, I guess, their validity, their humanity, because you don't want a hero that's good simply because it's the right thing to do. I guess you could say you don't want a hero that's just good because because that kind of makes them empty. And the Return of the King would not have been nearly as impactful for its readers, I think, if Aragorn was just an empty hero. He just simply was, that there was nothing to him other than his heroism. And I guess you could say on the opposite end, Sauron was the same way. He was human once. So there is ambition, and there are also flaws in that character, but he isn't for his own sake. Something led him to his desire for utter control over all of Middle-earth through the ring. So it's good to kind of keep those in mind. Another good example of evil for its own sake, the Lunar Games. Kind of unfamiliar, a bit on the cult classic side, but Lunar 2 specifically, its main antagonist was the god Zophar. He was the god of chaos, the god of evil, the complete antithesis to Althena. And that is a perfect representation of the cosmic balance that must be kept in order for things to flow. In order for the cosmos to be alive, it has to have both sides. So, yes, evil for its own sake is potent, and it's usable, but you have to be incredibly careful with who you align in that goodness or evil for its own sake. And it's best to just keep your main characters away from that description, because you want your audience to relate to your main characters as much as possible. Not so much their agents or their lackeys or their familiars, but definitely them. So, but they'll also have an attachment to their familiars because they're an extension of them. But it's okay to make their extensions a little empty, a little, I guess, gimmicky almost. But like I said, just keep your main characters out of that unless they serve a purpose. Unless, common and fantasy questing fix, unless your villain is the end-all, be-all bad of that world, it's okay to put him in that evil for evilness sake. When a villain becomes a godlike figure, it's okay to put them in the evil for evilness sake, and vice versa. So just use your instincts and your discretion. Show a little mercy with who you align that with. Let me see. Take time to get familiar with your heroes and your villains. I can't stress it enough, because they are going to be the beast of burden for your work. They are going to carry your plot almost entirely by themselves. So you want to take the time and the care to nurture them as people. As God of your book universe, you want to nurture them as much as possible and let them grow into fully fleshed, fully matured ideas, so that once you do get into the writing process and you have encounters with them for the reader, that they'll be able to pick up on them quickly and keep them in mind for as long as possible. You want memorable heroes and villains, and the only way you can do that is by being confident in what you've done to create them. Give them a backstory. Give them little details that you may think inconsequential, but your reader is going to grip onto to maintain the illusion they create by reading your work. You can't spend enough time working on your villains and your heroes. But use your discretion. Like I said before, don't make them too perfect or too flawed. Find a balance. Just like I said, use your discretion. The more you write, the better you're going to develop your author's instinct, and that's going to lead you to places that you find familiar, but also new places where you feel like you can really stretch your legs as a writer, get your fingers moving into different directions to really just let you grow as a writer. So take the time. There's no too much to forming your villains and your heroes. You just have to be careful with it. Let's see. Let's see. And one thing, it's slightly unrelated. Don't have some care when you're creating your character rosters. Don't make them too large. Unless you are indeed planning series. When you get to a point as a writer that you're really comfortable in your system, you may start planning series, which is perfectly fine. But be careful with making your character rosters too long, especially in the beginning. Don't take on too many more than you can handle. And as you grow as a writer, you'll be able to define what's too much for you. And you should really trust your instincts on this one. Some people can manage a full dozen characters and just for the side of good or evil and pull it off. Robert Jordan is a perfect example of this. And maybe even the Game of Thrones writer, Martin. G.R.R. Martin or R.R. Martin, I can't remember his full name thing. Martin is his last name, I'm pretty sure. But he has a slew of characters, and he manages to keep them all in check, keep them in character, and keep them making sense for the readers, or else you wouldn't have his work on TV. But some people can. Some people can pull that off. Most of us probably can't. I know I can. I can only have maybe half a dozen, maybe a couple more, and that's my limit. And even then, that's being generous, because I tend to keep some of them on the sidelines, where I know they're safe and they're secure and they're unchanging, so it's easier for me to keep track of them. But just keep track of that. And one element that I find that some authors tend to miss, that the video game industry tends to pick up rather well, redeemable villains. There is such a thing, as well as corruptible heroes. Sometimes the hero will falter, and sometimes the villain will rise above. It's an element that we rarely ever touch on, because I think as people, we like to limit things. We like to categorize and label things, especially in this day and age. Labeling someone makes it easier for us to understand them without making too much effort. So having redeemable heroes and villains really, redeemable villains anyway, and corruptible heroes, really kind of throws a monkey wrench in your readers' expectations and surprises them, which is sometimes a really good thing, to just to keep them interested. But take care with how you corrupt and redeem. There is a right and wrong way to do it, though I can't tell you what they are. You'll learn to find them as you get more experienced as a writer. So villains and heroes are very sensitive. So really take your time to plan them out, to do what you got to do to make them real. So quick recap. Avoid making characters too flawed or too perfect. Perfect example of a well-balanced protagonistic character would probably be Galadriel from, again, the Lord of the Rings series. She was a very pure character. However, she had a desire for the ring. So you really got to consider, and of course there was no tips to this until Frodo made the offer. So you really got to look at this. She's incredibly controlled, very pure. However, she still had that desire that was so quiet and then suddenly revealed, and you realize nothing's what it seems. So keeping that in mind, avoid evil and good that's for its own sake. Not necessarily altogether, but you may want to keep your main characters out of that facet unless it is the ultimate goal, particularly of a villain, to become that evilness for evilness' sake. So just take care with who you align on that side of the fence. Take time to get familiar with your characters. I can't stress it enough. They are going to carry your plot. So make the time and take the time to make them real people, to nurture them into someone that another human being can relate to when they read about them. Don't take on more characters than you can handle. Use your discretion. Follow your guts. You're going to know what is too much. And even if you don't, you'll find out. Trust me. And redeemable villains and corruptible heroes. There is such a thing. Try out and test. Do some research on seemingly evil people and culture that really turned out to be doing some good, and vice versa. So yeah, just keep that in mind and be diligent in your work. That's probably one of the biggest tips I can give you, is never quit. Never stop trying. Never stop doing the research or taking the time. So, yeah, that's episode 4, Heroes and Villains of Tips and Tricks for Writing Manuscripts. Tune in next time for episode 5, the Writer's Block Special. If you got a problem, hopefully I can find a way to help you out. I'll catch you next time.